Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the yard area at Buckfordsley Station for the third week of our South Devon Railway live videos. Last week we looked at the footplate of a steam locomotive, and Rodney very kindly told you all of the controls and some of his stories. And this week we're going to be looking at shunting vehicles, and we'll have a word with Alan, who you may remember from previous weeks. He'll tell us a little bit about how things work and some of the goods that were conveyed by rail. And if you do say hello in the comments, then Alan will be able to say hello to you. If you've got any questions as we go along, then you can ask them. Thank you very much, everybody who took part in our previous videos. We've got lots of very positive feedback from those. So we hope you enjoy this one. As we walk down towards the new shed area at Buckfordsley, we can see somebody's head poking out of a brake van there. Who's this? Hello, Alan.
Hello, folks.
How are you today?
I'm all right, thank you, and welcome everybody to the South Devon Railway for another one of our live broadcasts. We're here today, and I have to say thank you to everybody for their patience, whether you're a visitor or a volunteer. Thank you for your patience. We are really hoping that we are going to get back to some form of normality before too much longer. We will be letting all you volunteers know. There should be a branch line briefing newsletter out for those of you that receive it, and that'll give you an update this week on where we're at and what's happening. But today we're going to give you a trip around the yard, and we're going to explain the working of goods trains and how goods were conveyed by the railways years ago. And of course nowadays it's actually become even more important in this current crisis, and the railways are doing their bit in moving goods around the country. The big difference is that what you see now are lots of containers and tank wagons being moved by rail, and you've got no idea what might be in them. In the old days it was rather different, and the type of wagon often dictated what was in them. So if you'd like to come up here with me, we'll start to explain exactly what it's all about. I see there's a few people. Well, we nearly threw him off. Start again. James, Joseph, Mr. Haslam, and our own Fat Controller, John Cahan. Welcome you all. Well, I'm stood in the veranda area of what is known as a towed brake van. They were called towed because that was the telegraphic code that was applied to them by the railways originally, by the Great Western. They used, of course, telegraphic transfer for information. There weren't phones and mobile phones in the old days. They used to do it by Morse code, and towed was a simple short code rather than, say, brake van, which would have taken a lot of tapping. And all the wagons were all given those short codes. So I'm stood on the veranda of this towed brake van. Now, I'm also dressed in the uniform of a goods guard of the 1950s. Now, the nationalised railway, British Railways, when it came into being in 1948, created several regions. I'm dressed as a goods guard of the Western region. Now, goods guards were a lower grade of staff to the passenger guards. So when British Railways came along, new corporate image, one of the things was that the goods guard would have chrome buttons, whereas the passenger guards would have gilt. Now, that was also applied to the cap badges that were given to all the staff, and you can see my cap badge is a guard's cap badge of the British Railways era of the 50s, and it's got a chocolate brown background with a chrome surround and chrome lettering. So I've got a question for you. There were 6 regions that were created in 1948 under British Railways. Each one had its own colour code. The Western, as I've mentioned, was chocolate brown. So anybody that knows the answer, what was the colour for the northeastern region, put it in the comments, and we'll have a look in a few minutes and see if anybody's got it right. So that's the uniform of a goods guard. The other thing about the goods guard's role, and I'll just stop for a second, that somebody's asking, when can you open the online shop? We are meeting tomorrow morning with suitably distanced people to check the stocks in the shop. The online shop is ready to go, so we hope to launch it very soon, hopefully this week, but we'll see how we get on with getting the stock listed. Right, so back to the role of the goods guard. Now, in the 1950s, railway staff had quite a complex job and a lot more responsibilities than a lot of the railway staff these days. Now that's not to say that the job today is any necessarily easier, but it was certainly a very hard task in the old days. And in the 1950s, I have here my 1950s rulebook. Now this came into being from when the nationalised railways came along. They created this rulebook in 1950, which was a collation of all the rules of all the former independent companies. And in here are 239 separate rules. A lot of the footplate crews listening in will no doubt recall Rule 55, detention of trains on running lines. It was something of a famous one. There are also rules in here that governed all sorts of things, including goods guards, who had to know pretty much all of this rule book. But it wasn't just that rule book. They also had the general appendix to the rule book. They had the regional appendix to the rule book, specifically in this case the Western region. Didn't stop there. They then had sectional appendices dealing with certain parts of that. And this is the West of England division, which covered this area where the South Devon Railway is based. Now, just to give you a sample, one of the things that traffic that was carried by the goods trains in the old days was livestock. They used to take the cattle from the farms to the cattle markets. And for example here, when the line used to run to Ashburton in the 1950s, Ashburton had a weekly cattle market, and lots of the cattle being sold at that market would be brought in by train in cattle wagons. And in the regional appendix, there are very explicit instructions on how the cattle should be dealt with, including examination of livestock while in transit. Foremen, shunters, guards and others must examine vehicles containing livestock as frequently as possible in order to ascertain whether attention is required. If animals require to be watered, fed or milked, and so it goes on. And then there are specific instructions for watering, feeding and milking cattle. So can you imagine, if you're one of the people that is working on today's railway, like our chairman perhaps, how would you like it if you came in for duty tomorrow morning to be told you've got to go and milk the cattle in the cattle wagons on Route 1? Road 1, I should have said. Right, I was slightly distracted because I gather somebody has answered my question correctly. So for those of you that haven't or are still thinking about it, the colour of the northeastern region was tangerine. And if you're really interested, we can run through the whole lot, or we'll put them in the comments afterwards. Now, talking of livestock, the other thing about goods traffic was because there were lots of different wagons, and often in the old days you didn't have what we have now, which is block load trains. So they get loaded at one point, they get taken to another point, and that's where they finish and are unloaded. In the old days, you used to have pick-up goods that would run up each individual branch line, stopping at almost every station in order to pick up different wagons, to bring in loaded wagons and pick up empty wagons. These wagons would then be taken to a marshalling yard, where again it would be split up and sent on different trains to different parts of the country. So from Devon, for example, they would go first of all to this branch. They would first of all go to Newton Abbot, to Hackney Yard. They'd then go to Exeter and onwards, eventually up to Birmingham, and they could be marshalled into different trains several times at different yards. So the way in which the yard shunters and foremen would know where wagons had to go was by the use of labels on the wagons. They were very big. I've got a couple of examples here. This one, if you can see that, that's a wagon label for livestock. As I was talking earlier, lots of livestock would go by rail. This is quite an interesting one for those of you that are interested in railway history. It's issued by the Great Western Railway for a consignment of cattle from Basingstoke to Croydon in 1901. That's 119 years ago. This wagon was taking cattle from Basingstoke to Croydon. It says via South Eastern Railway. So just a bit of a brain teaser for you. Just have a think. What do you think might have been the route that would have taken from Basingstoke, bearing in mind that the main station at Basingstoke was on the London and South Western, and the Great Western only had a small terminus there. There's another label, slightly more modern. This is a British Railways version, and it's actually a label that would have been applied by one of the examiners because they'd found, in this case, a hotbox. So that wagon would be prevented from moving any further until such time as that hotbox had been sorted out. But in truth, other labels like this one would actually describe what the cargo was, but more specifically, where it was actually going. They'd also give details of the weights, because the guard, one of the responsibilities was to assess the weight of the train so he could let the driver know what weight of train he had behind him, how many wagons and what the loads were, all of which would have to be recorded in the guard's journal. And here's an example of it's actually a reproduction journal from the 1950s. And the guard would have to keep a full record, not just of the consist of the train, but also the working of the train, the times of where it went, where it stopped, any delays particularly that were incurred. So the role of the guards and all the other railway staff was actually quite complex, and it was actually also quite strenuous. Now, just before we leave this van, we're going to have a look at some of these wagons, and among other things, we're going to talk about the braking systems. Now, when the railways were first introduced in the 19th century, the trains, the only brakes were on the locomotive. They introduced a guard's brake on most of them, and after the Abbott's Ripton disaster in 1878, they introduced the rule, it was a parliamentary obligation, a legal obligation, that passenger trains had to have continuous brakes. Now, a continuous brake is where the driver of the train is able to control the brakes on every single vehicle, so that when he puts the brake on, it is applied on every single vehicle simultaneously, which means that it can stop in a controlled manner and not come to a shuddering halt. Goods trains, however, didn't even start to get continuous brakes until 1930, and in fact the last unfitted wagons, as they were called, that is wagons without a continuous brake, didn't disappear until the 1980s. So throughout this period, there was always a risk with an unfitted goods train, that's where every wagon had its own handbrake, but no means of the driver controlling it. It was down to the guard to actually help the driver with the braking of the train. Most guards, once they got used to the route, would know where and when to do this without the driver having to sound his whistles to get the guard to do it. Also, and most importantly, in the old days, the three-link couplings were prone to braking. So the guard, if the train divided, would be the only person who could stop the rear portion of that train running away, which he did using the handbrake. Here's the handbrake, and if the train did divide, the guard would be furiously screwing this handbrake down to stop the rear portion of the train running away. Now, the driver and the guard would frequently exchange hand signals during the journey, because again, the driver would want to know that the train is following in a safe and proper manner. He could look back and see whether the guard's van is there, but if he's got a train of vans, it might not be that easy to distinguish the guard's van. So the way it was done was the use of side lamps on wagons on guards vans like this. Here is a side lamp. It's got two quite thick lenses on each side of it, and in a moment I'm going to put it onto the lamp bracket on the side of the van. Now, what it also is able to do is show a red light in one direction by means of a shade such as that. So that would normally go to the rear. Now, there would be one side lamp on each side of the brake van, and there would be a tail lamp on the rear, just a conventional tail lamp as you would find on any passenger train. It's exactly the same. But it means that if you were behind if you saw a goods train pass and looked at it, you would see three red lights to the rear. But importantly, there would be white lights to the front, which the driver and fireman, by looking out on their respective sides, would be able to see that white light at night and know that the train is following safely. And during the daytime, the lamp protrudes out of the side of the brake van, and again, it tells the driver that he's got the train safely running behind him. So that's how it was done. Okay, I think it's probably about a good time now for us to go and have a look through the yard. So if you'd like to follow me, we'll step down. Okay, so we were talking up there about various different types of wagon. The first one that we've got next to us here is known as a Fruit D. That rather gives it away. That tells you that this primarily was used for carrying fruit from markets to... I see my wife's enjoying this video, thank you, Del. She's my greatest critic, you know. So these were used for carrying fruit from the farms and so forth to market. And you'll notice it's got the word passenger written there because these were built in such a way that they did have the proper braking system so that they could be used on passenger trains, which would get the fruit to market quicker because it's a perishable product. So the quicker it got to market, the better. So Fruit D, 10-ton loaded weight. The next wagon to it is a milk tank. Now the milk tanks were quite interesting because you'll note that in this particular case, these particularly the ones used in the West, it has 3 axles. It's a 6-wheeled milk tank. And there's a reason for that, because when that tank is fully loaded with milk, it weighs almost as much as a fully loaded passenger coach. So it's because of the weight of the milk that's inside it. That tank alone would take 3,000 gallons of milk. Now if you think about it, 3,000 gallons, that's 24,000 pints of milk, so it's quite a considerable amount that would go into each milk tank. Now again, these were allowed to run on express passenger wagons. In fact, there were several specific milk runs, as they were called, through the country. The longest was actually from the far end of Cornwall up to London. And the train used to leave the yard just outside Penzance. It would call with an express passenger locomotive hauling it. It would call first of all at St Earth, which, as you now probably know, is the junction for St Ives these days. But there was a creamery there, and it would pick up its first block of wagons. It would then travel up through Cornwall, picking up at places like Loswithiel, picking up more wagons. It would come into Devon, and it would pick up, for example, at Totnes. Then up to Exeter, where it would pick up wagons from Tiverton and other places. By that stage, it could be quite a long train, and this would then run at express speeds up to Kensington and Croydon in London, where the milk would be then discharged into another creamery up there, where it would be bottled and then taken to the shops and the markets and so forth for the public to use. I've had a question from someone saying, do we still run loose coupled trains? Well, the main line don't, but we do. We do run demonstration goods trains from time to time, and that's when we actually run loose coupled, or where we've got those sort of wagons. So we don't run very long trains, and we only do it with people that have been trained to work those trains, so they do know what they're doing. And I've never known us to have a broken coupling, and I hope I haven't jinxed it by saying that. Okay, so that's the milk tank. Now, you can see at the end there, that is actually part of the end. It hasn't got the valves on it now, but that will be used for the cleaning of the milk tanks. The actual milk will be put in through the top. So we've got actually on the South Devon, we've got 2 milk tanks. They're looking a bit jaded these days. We need to do a bit more work on them to bring them up to scratch, but they're nonetheless, they're useful examples of the sort of thing that used to be very commonplace on the railways, particularly down here. Totnes used to have milk tanks in the sidings at Totnes on a regular basis, and it was a familiar sight. It was one of those things that you used to see. We'll move on just a little bit, because you can see here, this is the clip where the wagon labels that I was showing you earlier, that's where it would go. Now, if you can imagine the shunter, the guards, the yard foreman, that's them, that's how they would know where the wagon was going. All the wagons would be fitted with those, and they would come along and read those labels so that they knew where these wagons had to be dispatched to once they arrived at the marshalling yard. So they used to have good eyesight, because if you remember, it wasn't easy to read that wagon label that I showed you, and you imagine doing it at night as well. So it was quite a task, and it was quite a responsibility. Otherwise you get the wagons and the cargoes going to the wrong places. Right. Now the next wagon we have is a fairly standard open wagon. There were hundreds of these, and in fact, once upon a time, the numbers of wagons on the National Railway network numbered in millions. There's nothing like that nowadays, but this is one of the standard 5-plank open wagons. Now, this is quite an interesting one because it actually is painted in the private owner liveries that used to be commonplace in the early part of the 20th century. The 19th and 20th centuries, there was a lot of private owner wagons which only really disappeared come the Second World War and then into British Railways days. But this one is Rennick and Wilton. Now, Thomas Wilton was actually a coal trader, and he lived up in the northeast of England. But he moved to Dartmouth in 1885, and he teamed up with Mr. Rennick, who was a local coal merchant in Torquay. And between them, they formed a business. And in 1889, they secured the contract for taking coal to Torquay Gasworks at Hollycombe. And the coal was brought in from, surprise, surprise, the northeast of England. Hence, Mr. Wilton's contacts. And he used to bring in 160, or at least, each ship that he brought into Kingswear would contain 160 tons of coal. Beg your pardon, it would take enough coal to fill 160 wagons, which were then shipped up to Hollycombe Gasworks in several train loads. And I gather, I'd see now, Ian Yolland says he's helped paint this wagon. Well done, Ian, thank you. It's given me the talking point. The wagons would be taken up to the gasworks, fed the gasworks, then empty back to Kingswear. And this cycle would go on throughout the day. The gasworks closed, I think, in 1968 finally. So unfortunately, that business disappeared both from Kingswear docks and from the railway traffic as well. But we don't know really much about Mr. Rennick and what happened to him, but Thomas Wilton did all right for himself. He ended up not just becoming Mayor of Dartmouth, but he also became Sir Thomas Wilton. So, not bad really for a coal trader from the northeast. Okay, let's just move on a bit up here. And here you can see, this one's known as a Lomac. This is actually from the London and North Eastern Railway, not the Great Western Railway, but wagons did get around all over the country. The Lomacs were used for carrying machinery, hence the lower level of the decal, for two reasons. One, it made it easier getting machinery on and off the ground level if that's what you needed to do, but more importantly, it meant you could get higher loads in underneath the loading gauge, because all railways have a loading gauge. The top of those coaches over there, for example, shows you don't want to go any higher than that, otherwise you'll strike the bridges as you go under them. Not a good idea. So the Lomacs were used for that sort of thing, for farm machinery or industrial machinery, whatever it might be. Now here we've got just a standard Great Western 5-plank open wagon. I mentioned that the one up there that was used for coal. Open wagons can be used for all sorts of cargoes. Now in Devon in particular, one of those cargoes would have been ball clay. I'm sure a lot of you have known about the China clay industry throughout the west of England. China clay is different from ball clay. China clay is what was found in Cornwall and surrounding Plymouth, at Lee Moor, for example. Ball clay is only found in two places in the country, Devon and Dorset. There is a deposit of it here, just up the road in Newton Abbot, in what's known as the Bovey Basin, and there was also a deposit on the north side of Dartmoor near a place called Petrotslope. Now, the ball clay is a very fine material and is deposited as clay. China clay, on the other hand, is more of a powdery substance. China clay is used for industrial purposes, but the ball clay is what is used for fine ceramics and so forth. So that clay, when it was quarried here in Newton Abbot, would be taken in wagons like this up to the potteries in Staffordshire. But also it would be exported from Teignmouth docks. So there was quite a traffic from the old Morton Hampstead branch, places like Heathfield and Newton Abbot, to go down to Teignmouth docks to be loaded aboard ships and taken off out, exported far and wide throughout the world. Because it was such a fine product, it was in high demand. That industry is still working today, and in fact 80% of the material that comes out of the quarries still gets exported. The only sad thing about it, of course, it now gets taken out by road to Teignmouth Docks, to Staffordshire, not by rail. So the railway's lost the traffic. Okay, over there you can see a couple of box vans, and there's also another slightly more interesting wagon here. Now this one is a shunter's truck. Is the shunters working in yards, so a lot of the yards, that's how they would get around the yard quickly, was to actually stand on that wagon. In the days when you were allowed to actually hang on to the outside of a wagon, the shunter would do that, hence the rails there. The box on the top is where he put his shunting pole and his brake stick. If there's time, I'll show you those in a minute. This wagon here, it's called a Mogo. That again is like the Tone, it's the short code. A Mogo is a covered motor carrying van, and at the end doors here, you can see there's double doors at the end. It would be pushed up against an end loading dock, and a car could be driven in there. Well, at least a car of the sort that were around up until the 1950s and early 60s could go in there. You wouldn't get a modern car in there, that's for sure. But that's the way that they used to take occasionally cars and so forth around. We've got a question. Have we had to stop buying coal due to the virus enclosure? Not due to the virus, but we're not using it. So no, we haven't actually had any coal deliveries recently, but I think we've got a fair stock here. You can see behind me. So we're not too badly off with coal at the moment. And we will order some just when we do open and need to restock. One point I ought to make is I'm wandering around here without the high vis on. Now that's because, first of all, nothing's running today. Secondly, in the 1950s and earlier, high vis didn't exist. And we do this for our demonstrations when we do special events and so forth, that a few of us will dress exactly as people used to dress in the 1950s, excluding the high vis. Now we do it because we know what we're doing, and we do have people around who are there to sort of keep an eye on things and make sure nothing goes wrong. But a question for you, and another one that you can come back on the comments. When was high vis introduced? I'll give you a clue. It was in the 1960s, but what year did high vis, orange high vis of course for the railways, what year was it introduced and in what part of the country? And we'll come back in a minute and see if anybody's got that one. Well, we just walked down the line of these wagons. I meant to say, you can just see through there if you look through. That's a standard covered wagon. And those, rather like the 5-plank opens, were a very, very common wagon to be seen, because of course you could put all sorts of things into those wagons that you didn't want to get wet in transit, for example. The opens would be used for things like coal and other products that it didn't matter if they got wet. Now, we'll just go down here and we'll show you.
Not too fast.
Try not to walk too fast so that everybody falls over. That's the only problem as they discover being a cameraman on a thing like this. Okay, so I mentioned shunting poles and brake sticks. So here's a shunting pole. One of the things about being a shunter or a guard, now the goods guard had to do more than a passenger guard. The goods guard was responsible for coupling and uncoupling the wagons and the locos and so forth. With a passenger guard, he could let the engine crew do any coupling and uncoupling that was needed, but not so with the goods guard. He would have to use the shunting pole. Now, that was introduced to give them some degree of safety, because as those of you that know heritage railways will realise, that the way to couple and uncouple normally is to go in between, as it's called, to go underneath and couple and uncouple vehicles. Now I won't demonstrate the exact use of the shunting pole because we've got screw couplings here. We haven't actually got one that's easy to use just at the moment, but just to give you an idea, the shunting pole meant that the shunter or guard could stand on the outside of the vehicle, get underneath the coupling hook and lift it up and uncouple the wagon. And that you had to become proficient, not just in uncoupling them, but using the hook on the end of the shunting pole, getting under the end of the coupling when it was released, and hooking it up onto the next wagon. And they got very adept at doing that. And it used to run a bit like a sewing machine. They would just go round and round. And a lot of the shunters would actually do it as the vehicles were coming together and still moving. But they got very expert at it. But it was a lot safer than them having to get underneath and go in between. So that's the use of a shunting pole, which I should put that way round so that the hook doesn't do any damage. Brake sticks. Now these were used to get a purchase on the brakes. You can see here, this wagon is the brake is on. So now the brake is off. That's a handbrake. You remember I mentioned that continuous brakes were only introduced back in 1930 for the first time on goods trains. Before then, the only means of braking was using that handbrake. And you could often loose shunt wagons into goods yards, and the shunter would have to run alongside and put the brake on as he went down. And you could use the brake stick to get an extra purchase on it. And in fact, what's known as pin down the brakes, because some of the brakes, I don't think we've got any here that we can show you, but the original brakes, they didn't have the ratchets on them. They had holes in this piece, and you put a pin in, and it was known as pinning down. And a lot of goods trains, you had to pin down the brakes before you went down a gradient to give you extra braking power, because as we said, other than the loco and the brake van, that was all the brakes you had. Okay, Richard Underhill, missing his SDR. Yes. Sorry, Richard, you haven't got those dates right. He suggested 1968 and 1967, but never mind.
I don't think that's the same person.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon. Those are just people's guesses. Okay. I think I'd better give you the answer then, otherwise we'll... and I think we're getting close towards the end of this broadcast, so I'll tell you. It was actually 1964, and high-vis was first introduced in Scotland, and then it was taken up and started to be used on the electrification of the West Coast Main Line. And now, of course, the Orange Army is everywhere. And in fact, as you go out on the railway, certainly if you're working on the track and so forth, often you're dressed not just in high-vis jacket, but high-vis trousers. You are completely orange. But once upon a time, this is how it was. And you can imagine at night, in freezing cold weather, in rain and snow, this was not a fun job for shunters, guards and others, having to work on wagons like this in the dark with only oil lamps, nothing else, and no high-vis. It was a very dangerous profession, and sadly quite a few shunters and others did lose their lives simply because of accidents in marshalling yards. So I think that's pretty much come to the end of the wagons that we've got them easily displayed today. So if there are any other questions.
We've got a question that says, did stations in the West Country have staiths in station yards for domestic coal?
Yes.
Like in the north of the country?
Yes, they did. In fact, Buckfast-Lee did. And when the Dark Valley first took over the branch, in fact, the coal merchant was still in residence in the yard at Buckfast-Lee. Now, that was the old yard at Buckfast-Lee, not this yard, because the old yard used to be on the other side of the station, underneath what is now the A38. And there was certainly a coal merchant in there with some coal stays not far from memory from where the signal box, the north signal box now is. And he was certainly working in there when the Dark Valley very first took over. There was also a cattle dock at Ashburton, which is where the cattle wagons used to be taken into, as I mentioned, during the cattle market days. But there wasn't a cattle dock here at Buckfast-Lee, although there was the dock, which is where the volunteer accommodation now is.
How are you doing on your fundraising appeal, Alan?
We're doing very well, thank you, and keep contributing though. We're sort of, I think we're approaching 140,000. The figure changes almost by the hour, so it's difficult to keep a running check on exactly. And we do have several sources. People can contribute on Facebook, through our website, and there's checks coming in direct. So we really do thank everybody that's contributed. It may well be what carries us through this crisis and gets us to the other side and gets us open again. And if anybody's thinking, when are we going to open? I'm afraid we still don't know, and a lot will depend on how the government change the restrictions. I know we're expecting an announcement today. We don't expect it to be anything dramatic. I'm being asked same time next week. Yes, it will be same time next week. We are hoping it'll be on signalling next time. One of the reasons I'm talking about goods trains today is because we couldn't find a signalman available today to give the signalling chat, so we've done this one instead, which we'd had in mind for the future. But next week, all being well, we will be doing something on signalling, probably a tour of Buckfast-Lee South signal box with a demonstration of how the signalling works, which will be useful for us because it will prove whether or not it's going to work when we do reopen, of course. Okay, well in that case, if there's no more questions, I think I will sign off, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you for watching.